to the video, and today we're going to be talking about how to improve your aim and one-clip people more often. Now, I'm just going to give you guys a couple tips and tricks that help me do it. I one-clip people quite often, and I'd like to think that my aim is pretty decent, so these tips should help you become better at aiming pretty much immediately. So the first thing I want to talk about is settings. I do have a settings video if you guys want to see my settings, but I don't necessarily recommend just picking someone else's settings. I recommend you go with something that's comfortable for you. I also recommend that you use lower sensitivity as opposed to higher sensitivity. I think it's a lot easier to control when it's lower, and also I feel like there's more room for mistakes when your sensitivity is too high as opposed to it being too low, and worst case scenario, you might not be able to turn fast enough, which rarely happens. So settings, very, very important. Just use what's comfortable for you. Try out a couple different sensitivities if you're not sure, but I would say below 6 is what you want to go with if you play on a high field of view. But that's all personal preference at the end of the day, so go with whatever's comfortable for you. So the next tip I have is aim center of mass. Now, I feel like a lot of people do not do this, and it's realistically how I one-clip almost everybody. I always aim for the chest area, somewhere in the torso. It could be lower torso or higher in the chest. But this is definitely the best method of aiming because you don't really have to worry about recoil compensation that much, and using your thumb to pull down the analog stick, or if you're using a mouse, you don't have to pull down the mouse that much. So it really helps you out in the end, because even if your recoil control isn't crazy good, it will kind of help you out because the gun will bounce up and hit them in the head. So you'll get headshots out of it just by not really controlling your recoil. So I'm just going to play in the firing range. That's another tip I have is, you can practice in the firing range, but I would advise not to practice with things like a gold stabilizer and a purple mag, just because, that's not really a realistic setting. I would practice more with things like no attachments, no sights, because if you can do it without an attachment and a sight, then you could do it with all the attachments. You want to use the least ideal loadout. That way you're pretty much prepared for anything. That way whenever you do get a gold barrel stabilizer, you can just easily do it. So if you practice on the stock guns and you get your one clipping down in the firing range, then you should be a little bit better off. So practicing in here overall is good, but it's not the best because at the end of the day, they're not moving. So basically the firing range should be used to try out new sensitivities, try out new aiming techniques like aiming for the chest and center of mass, and just practicing overall or getting warmed up. But it will not prepare you perfectly for a real game because people are moving everywhere. It's very fast paced, so you can't exactly account for that. But you can get warmed up in a firing range, get used to some of the guns and recoil, practice your recoil compensation. That's a really good time for it. But overall, you're going to get the best practice in real gameplay. So the next tip I want to talk about is recoil control. Now, this is basically just pulling down on your analog stick very slightly so that your aim stays in the same spot while you're firing. It's very, very crucial, and with guns like the R99 that has very high rate of fire and high recoil, it could be hard to control for a lot of people. As you can see here in the clip, without using any control of the recoil, the gun just bounces up and you missed most of your shots. Now in this clip I actually also compared the differences between aiming center of mass and aiming for the head. I don't use any recoil control at all, so this would just be a person holding R2 and doing nothing else. You would get much more damage by just aiming for the torso rather than aiming for the head. So this is also just proof that aiming center of mass does help. You're going to land more of your shots as opposed to someone who might be going for headshots. Unless your aim is like absolutely ridiculous, which at that point I don't know why you'd be watching this video. That's the only reason you should be aiming for the head consistently. But for the most part, the safest method for one-clipping people is aiming for the chest. You will consistently see more damage output and one clips while doing this. And it's also nice to pair it with recoil control, because then there's a pretty high chance that almost every bullet in your clip will go into the person. So right here, I just show where you should be aiming. It's a little bit below the chest area to about the neck area. That's where you should be aiming at. The lower, like, I'd say I'd probably aim more towards the upper chest, just because, you know, my recoil control is pretty good. So, you know, you can gauge that yourself. If you believe that you're not very good at controlling the recoil on guns, you know, aim a little bit lower. That way you have more room for error. Now, these tips are really, really good for guns like the R99, R301, you know, things that you want to one-clip people with. These tips don't really apply to guns like the Wingman. They still kind of do, because the chest is the biggest area of the body, so if you're aiming for that, you're more likely to hit it rather than the head. But you do get more reward for hitting a headshot with a gun like the Wingman, where it's like 90 damage as opposed to 45. So if you are on like the higher end of the spectrum in terms of your aiming, I would say aim for the head when you're using snipers or precision weapons, just because you get more out of it. So that's the only time I would say really aim for the head. Now, the next tip I want to talk about is using a comfortable sight. I am very biased when it comes to this. I basically exclusively use the 1X HCOG Classic. I believe that the red dot on it is very, it's very small, and it's not as clunky as the other sights, so it doesn't really get in your way. And that's pretty much all you can really ask for in terms of a good sight, is for it to not be too clunky and be in your way and everything, and be limiting your view of the enemy. I basically use it on every gun, except snipers, obviously. I use it on the Wingman, the R99, the R301. If I got a Spitfire, I'd use it on that. Any AR, any SMG, any light machine gun, I use the 1X HCOG Classic. I do believe it's the best sight in the game. If you don't use it at all, I think you should definitely give it a try. But, you know, just use what's comfortable for you. Don't use sights that are like a 3X on a light machine gun or an AR. That's not good. I don't really care what people say. That is not a good sight to be using on an R301. But it's up to you. At the end of the day, just use whatever's comfortable for you. That has a lot to do with aiming, is comfortability. But if your aim is not good, you want to kind of step out of your comfort zone. That way it gets better instead of just staying the same. So definitely try out the sight if you haven't used it. But next up on the list, we have practicing long range. So I like to do this in firing range just because it's a little bit easier, but it's really, really beneficial for you if you practice using guns like the R99 and R301 long range with no attachments on it, or you can put attachments on it if you really want to. But in the clip here, I am, you know, shooting these dummies pretty far away with the R99, and I end up getting pretty good damage off as well. So if you can practice, you know, hitting a majority of your shots that far away, you will be much better off. If the fight is closer, you'll see that your aim will definitely improve, because if you can do it from 3 times as far away from the gun is supposed to be used, then you'll be able to do it close up, no problem. Or at least you should be able to if you practice well enough. So this is definitely a good tip I would use in firing range as well. Just try hitting your shots from far distances that you would normally not use the R99 in. Like, this situation is a little ridiculous, but my aim with the R99 is pretty good long range, as you can see, but that's just from practicing so much, you know. And you're not going to be able to shoot like this unless you use this gun at long ranges, which in real games is not very practical, but if you need to do it, you will be able to, as well as it improving your aim drastically at all ranges. So that's all the tips I have for today. If you want to see a more in-depth video on different guns like snipers, I could talk about bullet drop, leading, and wingman shots, because I know sometimes they could feel like they're just not connecting. So if you want to see any of those videos, just comment down below. And thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.
You know